The death penalty is a very controversial issue that has been subject to many heated discussions and debates, namely its effectiveness and usefulness. Please come back here and join me here on 21st Century Issues as we talk about the usefulness and effectiveness of the death penalty. Welcome back to 21st Century Issues. Today we're talking about the death penalty. With me today is Jane Bowman, Director of the Coalition Against the Death Penalty, Kevin Smith, a county public defender, and Marshall Hartman, a state public defender. We'll start off our conversation. We'll talk about death penalty as a deterrent to crime. Have the murder statistics rates gone up or down?
Well, I think that rates of murder vary by state, and in general, over the last 25 or 30 years, they've gone up. But a very interesting statistic is what happens to death penalty cases. And recently, a national study was done of over 5,000 death penalty cases. It showed that over 60% of all death penalty cases are reversed by the either state or federal reviewing courts. In non-death penalty cases, for example, the rate is like 15%. So that's an astounding figure, and it really leads one to question the efficacy of the death penalty just on the basis of those figures.
A lot of the turnovers because of a technicality in the law or because of the crime and the evidence?
That's really a wonderful question. Let me assure you, no murder case or death penalty case is ever overturned on a technicality. What sometimes some people think of as technicalities are the U.S. Constitution. The only reason that a death penalty case would be reversed would be a violation of either the state constitution or the federal constitution. Otherwise, or maybe some evidentiary rule, but it's never a technicality.
No.
It's always fundamental.
There is no such thing as a technicality. Marshall's right. What people like to view as technicalities are the law, and the laws are there to protect everyone, the accused as well as the non-accused. You ask about the death penalty, I assume that's you're going back to when the death penalty was instituted at the end of the 1970s and how it's affected the rate of crime. The rate of crime functions independent of what the punishment is. And the murder rate has gone up. We've seen it gone up. We see it coming down. It really has no relation to what the punishment is. And there's societal factors that figure into that. And in terms of how many people are charged with murders, that remains fairly constant because that's a police function. The police clear X number of cases a year, and that's a function of manpower and how they investigate cases. It really has nothing to do with how many murders there are. When the murder rate goes up, the number of cases you see coming into the system remains fairly constant over the years.
So would the rise or fall of either murder or any crime, what is the main result? Is it the economy? Is it the social status? Is it the higher standard of living or lower standard of living?
You know, it's really hard to say. I've been dealing with murder cases since the 70s, and full-time since 1984. For 17 years, I've represented hundreds of individuals. I've talked to thousands of individuals, quite literally, who are charged with murder. I've sat through all kinds of trials, death penalty cases. I've tried about 35 capital cases, and I wish I could say what the answer is to your question, but there are so many variables that come into play that you can't pinpoint. Basically, if the economy is good for the people in general, your crime rate goes down. If education goes up, the crime rate goes down. But beyond gross generalities in society, it's really hard to say what factors come to play?
When ex-President Clinton put the extra crimes on there that can be eligible for the death penalty earlier when he was in office, are prisons becoming more full or less full, even besides murder or any cases? Now that we still do have the death penalty and most states do carry the death penalty, not the chair, the gas chamber, but now that many use the lethal injections, are prisons still becoming more full or less full?
The prisons are becoming, they're full, they're burgeoning, and that issue has nothing to do with what we're talking about,
Right.
the death penalty. It is a function that somewhere in the 80s, probably there was a shift from rehabilitation to retaining individuals. And once society decided that the goal was no longer to rehabilitate a young person, to make them a productive part of society, then the flip side came into play, and then what do you do? So what we've seen are predominantly young men and predominantly minority young men have been locked up at a younger age for a longer period of time. And the theory is warehousing. It's to take young men, basically your age, and then to try and incarcerate them beyond when they will be a danger to society. And so what we've created, and what we'll find in the future, is there is a whole lost generation in certain parts of our society due to this sentencing. And we will have hundreds of thousands of young men without education and without skills and without a future. And it'll be a price that will be paid for tens of years to come.
I just wanted to add one thing on the deterrence issue. There have been literally dozens of studies on deterrence and the death penalty, and the vast majority of them have indicated that there is no general deterrent effect from the death penalty.
So even though the death penalty is still there, it still does not deter criminals from committing the crimes that they will commit even if there wasn't a death penalty?
The statistical evidence says no, and I think one of the things that certainly I would defer to the individuals who've dealt with these cases is that many murders are committed under the influence of drugs and alcohol. Many are done at a young age when people aren't thinking about consequences. Many are done in the heat of passion, and so as Sister Helen Prejean, the anti-death penalty activist, said, the people doing the killing and the people doing the thinking are not the same people. And so I think there are other factors that contribute to that. And the New York Times just did a recent study that showed that states that do not have the death penalty have homicide rates between 50 and 100% lower than death penalty states. And for example, Illinois, many people don't know this, is ringed literally by states that don't have the death penalty: Iowa, Michigan, Wisconsin, then up to Minnesota. And all those states have lower rates. And Michigan, which is probably the most comparable state since it also has a major city, has lower homicide rates than us. And so our homicide rate hasn't gone up during the moratorium. They're just not related. And the notion that we need the death penalty to keep us safe, especially in Illinois where we have life without the possibility of parole as an alternate sentence for the kind of people like Gacy or others who really do frighten us a little bit, we just don't need it as a crime prevention or control measure. And when we've had all the problems and the costs associated with it, it seems on a policy level it's just not necessary.
From an anecdotal point of view, the public defender represents people not on a philosophical level, but at one client at a time. And having talked to hundreds of people, I can tell you that what the sentence was has never deterred anyone from committing a crime and never deterred anyone from committing a murder. The best that can be said about what motivates someone is it seems like the right thing to do at the time. and they don't think about what the consequences are beyond the moment.
They're not thinking, I'm going to go to jail for this. I can't possibly get the lethal injection for this.
It's a very short-sighted reaction. They react to a situation, they don't think it out, they don't have a plan for the future, and it's what works at the time, and they don't really have a long-term plan. So what the sentence is pretty irrelevant, and you're going to find now with the current sentencing, where we went from 50% time to 100% time, that the whole concept of sentencing is beyond the ability of most of the people charged with serious crimes to understand in a time point of view. Whether I am sentenced to 20 real years of my life or I am sentenced to death, if I am a 17-year-old, well, an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old, it doesn't matter. I'm not getting out of penitentiary at any time where I can do something with my life. So I don't care if I'm in for 20 years or if I die.
Right.
There's no thought to it.
All right, well, we'll continue the discussion right when we come back after these messages. Welcome back to 21st Century Issues. We are discussing the death penalty. We're now going to move on to something the Illinois public has been long waiting an answer for, is how can 13 men who were sentenced to die be let off the death penalty, something that's supposed to be handled so delicately that only the guilty of the guilty are supposed to be sent to this. I mean, it's a fated death. They are sentencing a man to die, and they messed up 13 times. Can you find a reason for
Well, I work with the Capital Litigation Division of the State Appellate Defender Office, and we were appointed to the case of Anthony Porter, who was one of the 13. And we also had a panel lawyer named Dan Sanders and a staff lawyer named Terry American who worked on it. And also the Northwestern journalism students worked on this case too. But what happened was that he was within 2 days of being executed. He'd been in prison for about 18 years. And we raised the question of whether he could be executed because he was not competent to understand with the death penalty. He had a 51 IQ. And
That's
so that,
below.
yeah, the normal IQ is 100, 70 is usually considered retarded. So he was at 51. But while we were litigating that, the Northwestern students were able to get a confession from the real killer. Now, in all of these cases, the question is, how could all the 13, maybe even 14, how could this occur? And a variety of things occur. Sometimes, in one case, a state witness said, Mr. X did it. Then later, before he got executed, she said, you know, he didn't do it. Who did? I did it. In some other cases, the view is that that police pressured witnesses to say that a certain defendant did it. And later, for example, the person would say, well, he didn't really do it. It's just the police pressured me. I felt nervous. I was coerced. And they didn't really tell her to lie, but the pressure was a lot. In general, over 60% of Illinois capital cases are reversed. And there are three basic reasons. One, the prosecutor has done something wrong. He has not given certain evidence to the defense, which might be helpful to the defense, and he's supposed to do that under the law, or some other reason. Two, the defense lawyer may have been ineffective. In one case, the defense lawyer did not tell the jury that his client had saved the lives of 3 people. And when the jury considered whether or not he should get the death penalty, they were unaware of his prior good deeds, and that was reversed by the federal court. Another case might be a judge may give wrong instructions or make some kind of ruling. So it is a very difficult problem, and if it's not a death penalty case, it can be fixed. But if it is a death penalty case, then people get very nervous because the person could be executed, after which you'd say, whoops,
Yeah.
very difficult problem.
He's gone.
And so for that reason, Governor Ryan imposed a moratorium because of that Porter case. I think it was one of the cases that forced him to do it, to say, wait a minute, I'm not authorizing any more deaths until I find out what's what with this system. How could 13 or 14 people be actually innocent? And he appointed a commission to investigate this, and that's what's happening now. The commission will have the report perhaps in March.
About
one thing that the general public doesn't usually understand and doesn't see is that especially in Cook County, which is the largest county in the state, there is a great reliance not on science in trials, but on the words of witnesses, the words of the defendant. The Chicago Tribune's running a series right now about flawed confessions. People do confess to things they didn't do. I was involved in a case where 3 young men confessed to a one-person crime. When the eyewitness, who was the widow of the deceased, testified that none of the young men who were on trial were involved in the armed robbery of her husband, and that it was only one man. It couldn't have been 3 no matter what. The judge acquitted the young men, but then yelled at the witness for screwing up the case. I had a case where the defendant was in jail, and we proved scientifically through the medical examiner and through a forensic entomologist, which is a bug doctor, and you go through the life cycle of blowflies. It's very interesting, but that the crime happened at a time when the defendant was actually in jail. And the judge said in his finding that, well, obviously the medical examiner and the doctor were wrong because he was in jail then, so he couldn't have committed the murder. So the murder had to have happened at some other point in time.
Yeah.
And another whimsical way the death penalty gets imposed, actually a judge told a young man he was not going to sentence him to death. He was going to sentence him to natural life, and asked the young man to sit down. The young man didn't sit down. The judge said, "If you don't sit down, I'm going to change my mind." The young man didn't sit down. The judge says, "I've changed my mind. I hereby sentence you to death." Now, it took some months, but we eventually undid that. But there are just such vagaries that go into these cases. This is how innocent people end up getting convicted. And if you are innocent and you push against the system to prove your innocence, and the system doesn't like to be pushed against. The system is set up for accommodations. The death penalty, because there are so many different categories under which one can qualify for the death penalty, there's 20-some now,
cases.
that it borders on the arbitrary, and when I see it actually used, it's capricious, it's oftentimes whimsical, but it is a chit that the state uses to keep people in line. If you're looking at the death penalty and the state says, well, we'll take that off the table if you plead guilty, even the innocent will plead guilty. The truly innocent, who are committed to their innocence, forge ahead. And the more you push against the system, the more the system pushes back. And even though people think that the truth is a powerful weapon and a tool, and it is, you have to have time. And time is on the side of the wrongly accused. But if you compact the system as the trend is and towards how the new rules are going to go, we eventually will convict or we will execute someone who is truly innocent. And kind of the gallow humors is that you will never execute an innocent man. And the reason for that is that once someone's executed, the people who care, the people who are investigating, move on to other things. And rarely, once someone is dead, does anyone look into the facts of their conviction to exonerate them posthumously.
It's only the family that could push that. Well, the defendant can't, come back from the dead and say, hey, I didn't do this, but the family could possibly push for it.
There have been some efforts by the Catholic Church, newspapers, and family members to obtain the DNA evidence that might exonerate people who have already been executed. And rather than agree to seek the truth, the state has fought those efforts and has succeeded up to this point. And more insidiously, prosecutors have instructed their offices in a number of cases when the exoneration started coming to go back and destroy rape kits and other DNA evidence before these new rules could apply to them. So I think that there is a belief by the public that in a death penalty case, everyone is acting only at the highest standards, only the best people are involved, and in some cases they're fortunate enough to get the representation of the experienced public defenders in Cook County, but many times they get appointed lawyers who are not adequate in these smaller counties, or they get a private lawyer who doesn't get enough money to do. In the Porter case, the lawyer said he could either investigate the case or fight the death sentence, and he decided to fight the death sentence. And so he never investigated a case that took the Northwestern journalism students an hour and a half to pull apart and determine was totally impossible to have happened the way the cops and the prosecutor were saying it was happening. So people in the public, or the public, needs to understand that the death penalty is not administered with the highest standards, and in many cases, the police and the prosecutors, because of a high-profile case, because of the pressure, because the prosecutor is an elected official and subject to public scrutiny and pressure in an election cycle, that they will, even if they're not setting out to convict an innocent person, they will oftentimes bend the rules, push the limits, because they feel such tremendous pressure to gain convictions. So the Tribune, in their series that was published in late '99, it's a wonderful thing to look at if people can get it on their website. There's a lot of information out there for the public to access, and because the state of Illinois is executing people in our name, it's an important issue for people to look at and make their minds up, because it is literally a matter of life and death.
All right, well, thank you. We'll be right back after these messages with more discussions from the 21st century issues. Welcome back to 21st Century Issues. We are discussing the death penalty. We're going to move on to our next topic. We'll start off with you, Mr. Harmon. Do you think race or class is a factor in deciding who receives a death penalty?
I think that race is an important factor, and I say that not to suggest that anybody in the system is racist, but the statistics are mind-boggling. A number of studies have been done, beginning with one by Professor Baldus down in the South, where he examined 2,000 cases, and it showed that the race of the victim was such that if it was a white victim, the defendant had 4 times the chance of getting the death penalty than if it was a black victim. And in some other states, it's even worse. Where there's a black defendant and a white victim, in one state in this country, the chance of getting the death penalty in that instance, as compared to a white defendant and a black victim, are 84 times. So in other words, if you're black and you kill a white victim, in that state, you'd have 84 times the chance of getting the death penalty. And in Illinois, 4 times is plenty. In addition, we have on our death row in Illinois about 161 people. It varies a little bit. Of that number, over 70% are black, 100 are black, and 61 are white, which is the highest in the nation. Again, why is this? And some of the statistics show it's not because blacks do more, it's just that a higher percentage of blacks who commit these crimes will get the death penalty. So this is a problem, and we have to somehow be race neutral. And practices like, if there's a black defendant, kicking blacks off the jury is really something which is unconstitutional. Illinois Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court has said you can't do it, and some people still do it. So it is definitely a factor and something we have to deal with.
Any of you guys have any views on that?
Well, you know, in the work I do, I represent indigents. So predominantly we have a minority clientele. And so really statistically, I can't tell, because all our clients would fall into this category. So every one of our clients that the state seeks death on falls into this category of either being probably Hispanic or black, predominantly black. But one thing you will see, though, that if the crime is black on white, you're in bigger trouble than if it's black on black. If it's minority on minority, there is a cynicism that kicks in. There is a great deal of concern for the victim and the family of the victim, often expressed. You'll see that more if there is a racial disparity between the accused and the victim, and at times I have seen the state almost go into a frenzy over trying, when there is a white defendant that will fit this profile, they could break the stereotype. Sometimes the state bends over backwards just to try and show that a white middle-class person can be convicted and can be sentenced to death. Rarely does that happen, especially in Cook County, because statistically there just aren't that many opportunities. But the tension's out there. I know it's out there. The system overall is a racially biased system. And that's not to say that people are, as Marshall said, racist. But there is a racial bias within the system, and maybe it's a class bias. Maybe it's because there's a bias against poor people. Maybe it's a bias against people who are undereducated or underemployed or unemployed. But there is a bias, and it carries straight through the system, and it carries right on to the death penalty.
I think that the statistics definitely speak for themselves, and I think that one of the things that people need to understand about the death penalty is it has a long history, and especially in the South, there were crimes for which only blacks could be sentenced to death, for example. And one of the justifications for continuing the death penalty when it fell out of favor in the past was that it would keep people from lynching. So it has a direct racial history, and we're never going to be able to eradicate these biases that, I mean, I agree with all the biases that you listed as factors that may, and when you're talking about taking someone's life, the state going beyond just incarcerating someone and actually getting into the business of taking their life, when we see over and over these illegitimate factors playing a part, and it's never really gotten better, and in fact, I would say it's getting worse, then it's just time we say, well, is this a business we should be in at all?
How do you see the future of the death penalty here in America or just in Illinois?
Well, as the director of the Coalition Against the Death Penalty, I can say that certainly the forces lining up to fight the death penalty continues to grow and grow, and it is a recognition that it's unfair, that it doesn't deter crime, that there are alternatives that are more humane, and that there are more effective ways to prevent crime in the first place that have led so many people. I think their eyes were opened by the wrongful convictions, but the more people find out, the more they want to put an end to this practice by the state. And so we're really confident that as the debate continues with the Governor's Commission report, that the question will not be how do we fix the death penalty, but why in the world would we want to? And we will join our sister states up north who don't have it, and also virtually all of the Western world, which has rejected the death penalty. You can't even join the European Union if you have the death penalty. So we need to catch up to those people, and I think awareness is growing, and with more articles like what we're seeing in the Tribune this week and more evidence that's going to come out of other wrongful convictions, the public is really going to stand up and say, we do not want this going on.
I would like to think that Jane is right, but the view from the trenches is a little different. I think that what we're going to look for, see in at least the short term, after the next gubernatorial election, is an increase in the number of executions that are carried out. I think we will also see an increase in the number of times the death penalty is imposed. And this is before the reforms are actually articulated or take effect. There is a disconnect actually between what is going on in the real world and what goes on in the political world. And the political world controls the death penalty. I often say that every capital prosecution is political.
Yes.
And sometimes it's a capital P, and sometimes it's a small p, but it always involves politics.
Okay. Let me just say this. I think that what's going to happen is summed up by the words of Justice Blackmun of the U.S. Supreme Court, who in a recent decision just said this: I was in favor of the death penalty. 24 years ago, I voted for it. Having seen the administration of the death penalty in the U.S. over the past 24 years, it's not possible to administer it fairly. And now 2 justices of the Illinois Supreme Court have come to similar views that it's not possible to administer it fairly. And so I think that that is where the issue is going to be. Not so much whether it's right or wrong, but whether or not we can fairly administer it. And if we can't, we just have to abandon it.
And we can't.
Right, and the public has to make it known. I agree, it's a political football. It's not a legal issue, it's a political issue, and the only way politicians are going to catch up to the rest of us is if we raise our voices and let them know.
All right, well, I'd like to thank you for appearing on my show, Ms. Bowman, Mr. Smith, and Mr. Hartman.
Pleasure.
I'd like to thank you for watching. We'll see you next time here on 21st Century Issues.